Hey guys, this is Miss Jenkins. I'm recording the lesson for Unit 10 or Chapter 10. I already recorded it once, but for some reason my recording app on here did not record it correctly, so I am just going to go on and record it again for you guys. Let me get that out of the way so that way you guys can have it. On the board is a review from last week. I am not going to give you the answer today. If you would like to watch the recording for class, you can get the answer. Again, you can write it down and I'll give it to you in class. I'm not going to do it here on the recording just because I want you guys to make sure you can, pay attention to it. So we'll look at it in class. This week is the 21st through the 25th. You have FRQ number 2 is due on Friday, and we will go over that on Wednesday in class. That way, if you guys have questions, we can answer them. Just remember that information is online, so make sure that you're paying attention to that. Here are our key terms. We're looking at intelligence this week, thinking and learning. So a lot of our vocab is dealing with intelligence and giftedness. Key people to look at, there are about 4 people on here that are super important to pay attention to. You want to look at Vygotsky, Freud, Erikson, and Piaget are all very important, influential people, especially for educational psychology. A lot of Erikson and Piaget are used, but again, these are going to be our main people that we're focusing on. All right, so this week we are looking at thinking, language, and intelligence. So make sure that you are paying attention to that. Our first section is talking about thoughts as images. What that is looking at mental maps, using images to put things inside your head, like remembering directions. If you use landmarks, that's going to be putting images in your brain. Again, things like that, so that you can kind of cement things in your head just to make them easier to remember. That's one way of doing it. When we're looking at thoughts as concepts, this guy right here on the left is he is autistic, and he can literally go up in a helicopter right around a city looking at it for 5 or 10 minutes. And then when he comes back down, he is able to reproduce everything that he saw with minute detail. So he has the ability to perfectly reproduce everything that he sees. So that's a very unique talent that he has. When we're talking about thoughts and concepts, we're talking about animals being able to see things. When we're talking about, in the chapter, it talks about this little pigeon here, being able to remember using positive reinforcement. Dogs, when we're talking about dogs, generally dogs are able to be taught things and are able to even sometimes be able to tell you what they're thinking. Something recently that I would say within the past 5 years, where they're teaching animals to press buttons with words on them so that you know what the animal wants. Words like leave or cuddle or mom or dad or food or hungry, things like that, where basically you're able to communicate with animals. You can find tons of these on Facebook, TikTok, where the animals are pressing the buttons to tell you things that they want. I have one that I watch on my Facebook called What About Bunny? Bunny is like a standard poodle. And she is so funny because sometimes she'll be like, Mom, mad, or mad, Mom. And then there's another dog in the house and she's mad because the dog's on the couch, or, she doesn't want the dog on the couch, or it's hilarious. But there's some that you can find where animals are actually telling you their thoughts. And then in this bottom one here with the hippopotamus, it's talking about children being able to tell you exactly what they're thinking by making connections to what they're already exposed to. So for instance, if you take a child to an aquarium and they see, a hippo, which that wouldn't be in an aquarium, but you take the kid to the aquarium and maybe they're able to see this giant fish. Well, they don't know exactly what the giant fish is, so they're going to pull names for things from what they're already familiar with. So maybe they're familiar with a penguin and they say penguin and it's really a dolphin or something like that, because they don't have the actual words to make connections with what they're seeing. So that's a thought on how we produce, we are able to do things. Another way is looking at how we problem solve. One of the ways that we do that is through this 4-step program here. So understanding the problem, making a plan, carrying out the plan, and then looking at the problem, how it's solved, and then reevaluating the whole process. Now in the book, it also tells about a different type of process, like this system engineer evaluation. Basically, they evaluate at each step rather than just at the end. So this is a little more complex version of problem solving, but that way, you're aware of what's going on. We also have the biology of decision making. Whenever we're talking about decision making, we're talking generally about younger, adolescents, teenagers, and how their decision making varies depending on who is with them in, for instance, a car. So when the adolescents are in a car with their peers, say a bunch of 16-year-olds are in the car together, they're going to act and have more risky behavior than they would if, for instance, an authoritative figure was in the car with them. So when I was an example, because, I was a dumb kid way back when, I used to be in marching band, and on Thursdays we would have to get in our cars and travel to the site where the marching band performed. We practiced at our stadium once a week so that we could actually see what it looked like at the stadium versus in a parking lot. So when we would go, I would sometimes drive my friends, carpool, and they would play this silly game when they got to a stoplight. What they would do is, it's basically like musical chairs. So the kids, I obviously wouldn't get out because I had the driver's license, so I wouldn't do this, but they would all, as soon as we got to a stoplight, they would open all the car doors, run around the car, and then when the light turned green, they would jump back in, and then we would drive off. Now, obviously, that's something that, silly kids would do, right? And they would not do that with, say, an adult in the car. But, kids act sillier when they are with their peers than they do when they are around more adult figures. All right. And that's because the frontal lobe is not truly formed until they are about 25 years old. So because your decision making is done in the frontal lobe, with it not being complete until that point, then that can be a problem. So just be aware of that. That's where your decision making is. Origins of language. So talking about how language progresses across the world. Obviously, language started in the Middle East, which is where society started, and then it spread, Eastern from there. All right, so let's talk about some building blocks of language. So language did not start, one day we had no language and the next day, boom, we automatically had a language. That's not how it works. It progresses over time. One of the oldest forms of language was not actually words. It was sounds or clicking with the tongue. That is shown to be one of the earliest forms of communication in some African tribes. And then it progresses from just the clicking of the tongue to sounds, and then from sounds to words. And our language, even today, is still progressing. That's something that changes every day, every year. We just progress a little further. All right. Some language disorders, we've talked about these before, but when we're talking about language disorders, we're talking about Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Your book actually talks specifically about how these areas were named and why they were named. So it's interesting for you to read that. Remember, Broca's area is where you can hear language and understand it, but you cannot reproduce the sounds in the words. Maybe you're just not able to find them. Maybe you just can't get them out. But that's damage to Broca's area. And then Wernicke's area remember, that is when there is damage and you're not really able to comprehend what people are saying, and people can't comprehend what you're saying, but you don't realize that, and you're still like a happy person, because you just don't realize that people don't understand you. So remember those two different areas. When there's damage to that, that's called aphasia. So it's Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. So there's those two different areas. And then we talk about how animals communicate. So do they use language? Well, it says real language. Real language is, that's something that different people have different views on. So just be aware of that. We have patterns of animal communication. Your book has 3 different ones. I find them kind of interesting. Part 1 talks about signaling danger or identifying territory. So think about that as like a gorilla who is, coming towards you and defending his area. He's going to be aggressive. He's going to try to keep you out, but he doesn't actually have to do anything other than maybe rush towards you, maybe beat on his chest a couple of times, and just that aggressive stance, that aggressive posture. That's going to tell you everything you need to know without understanding words. Another way that animals communicate is signaling magnitude. So that would be kind of like when you see bees dancing. So just kind of flying up and, different ways of them communicating. And then the last one is called a sequence of behavior. That's kind of when birds are singing, because not all birds sing, only certain ones do. But you are able to see that they're communicating even if you're just seeing it visually. Okay. Our next section is how do we learn language? So there's several ways that we learn and teach language. One of the ways that we have learned to teach language to animals is through sign language. So American Sign Language, or ASL. That is one way that we can teach animals how to communicate. Again, nowadays animals, they use those press buttons where it says a word. Basically, you press it, you say the word, and you show the action to the dog, and then give a reward. And then every time they repeat that and it's the correct thing to do, you give them a treat and they're rewarded for it. And they remember, hey, I did this when I needed that and I got a treat. So if they repeat that behavior, then you continue to give them treats until the behavior becomes second nature. Another way that they did this was with parrots, and they realized that parrots were able to correctly state color, shape, and even material after only doing it 6 times. They had 100% accuracy. All right, and you're just like, well, how is that helping anything? Well, excuse me. What happens is they use that positive reinforcement to teach the animals how to recognize things. So for a parrot, they would show the parrot a board and say blue, and every time the parrot picked the blue letters, they would give them a treat. first they would point to it and say blue, and they would show the parrot blue, and then they would give the treat. Then they would say blue, and they would point at it and give a treat. And then eventually they would say, which one is blue? And the parrot would pick the blue one and get a treat. So by having that positive reinforcement, it shows them that they're learning different things. And they just keep reinforcing that over several days until it's second nature. Now, language processing, we're not talking about language diseases or disorders here. We're just talking about how the brain processes differently. One of those is dyslexia. That is a divergence in the processing in the brain that leads students or people to have trouble understanding written language. Now, it's not anything with spoken language, only written language. Now, this is a problem for people, and they have to work really, really hard to overcome it and teach their brain how to organize things in certain ways. And again, this is a difference in the way your brain is processing information, and it's just slightly different for dyslexic students. Now, you also have multilingualism, where you're able to speak multiple languages. In the U.S., that's not really the norm. Most U.S. citizens only speak English. And that's kind of a problem because our counterparts in other parts of the world all speak multiple languages, especially in the South African area, like we are showing here. They all speak at least 2 to 3 languages, some of them 3, 4, 5 languages. So, that's a lot of languages to learn. And what happens is that they build off of these languages to make it easier. Romance languages have a lot of things similar, and they're easy to build one on top of the other. So if you're taking, say, French and English and Italian, French and Italian and Spanish, those are all Romance languages, and they all have similar building blocks to make it easier to learn those languages. Okay. Now, you also have people that are what's called polyglots, and that's where they have many languages. There is a savant, a young boy who, even at a young age, I would say 17 or 18, was able to already speak 20 or more languages. Nowadays, he's older than that, and he, I want to say, can speak up to 50 languages. So he is able to comprehend those languages and build on them, and able to put that to use and be able to have those conversations. A third processing language is ASL, or American Sign Language. This is a language that's built off of gestures from your hands. There are different sign languages throughout the world. They are similar, but they are also very different. American Sign Language is generally used by the deaf and possibly people that are mute. They use ASL to communicate. ASL is a very complicated and complex language, and the ASL community is very insular. They have their own culture, they have their own community, they have their own schools, their own colleges. It's really like a society within a society. So just be aware, a lot of times those ASL interpreters come from families where maybe they had deaf parents or possibly a deaf sibling or relative, and they come from families that already have some basic knowledge of sign language, and they're just generally building on that. So just be aware that's kind of what's going on with that. All right, so let's get into intelligence. When we're talking about intelligence testing, this one that's on the board is generally done in the elementary school level because you have a lot of EL students that don't speak English, and it makes it much harder to do an intelligence test if the kids have to read. So for the younger kids, what they'll do a lot of times is use these picture ones, which basically what they do is they see if you are able to have pattern recognition, if you're able to then reproduce the pattern, as well as then think outside of the box, because that's really what they're looking for with these students that are so advanced. They're looking for the kids that really can think outside of the box, and they get bored easily, and they recognize these patterns. Now, this one on the board is from an older test that used to look at the student's age, their calendar age, as well as their mental intelligence age, and they would then take that and divide it out or whatever they do in order to get the IQ tests. So there are several ways that IQ tests are done. There's several different scales. One of them is a Stanford Binet intelligence scale. Now that one basically is saying you're not gifted unless you're 130 and above, and that's perfectly fine. That's basically the same thing this one right here is. The only difference is it has different specific levels where it gauges, where people are at. Most people are in this mid-range here, in the 80 to 120 range. That's generally where everybody's located at. On this scale, it's showing 85 to 115. That's still pretty general. Me and my daughter did a intelligence test online, I want to say about a year ago. And me and her both tested in the 120 area. I think I was like 120 and she's like 125. So that for us is testing a little bit on the high side, not quite to the gifted area, but it is still on the high side. So most people nowadays can go online and get a free IQ test, just showing you the differences in the two scales. There are many other scales, but here are two that are the most widely used. All right. Next to last, we have biological influences. This is talking about whether or not your brain structure affects your IQ. Basically, it shows that if you have a high IQ test and you have more gray matter in your brain, then that affects your IQ and makes your IQ higher. The same person that scored the same on the yellow and the red lines here both had the same IQ test, but each of them had different amounts of gray matter in their heads. So that shows you the differences in that. Basically, they're saying more gray matter, more higher IQ. Again, that's not something that you can necessarily prove. This not research, but this test that's on here is looking at the differences between twins. Now, with twins, you have fraternal twins, which come from two separate eggs, which are basically siblings that are just born at the same time. And then you have identical twins, which come from comes from one egg that has split in half, and they're identical. Now, this test shows on here that fraternal twins do not have as much in common as identical twins do, which that would be what you would expect, since fraternal twins are not identical, and they come from two separate eggs. So they're as similar as two siblings would be. Our last section talks about poverty and intelligence. Basically, the fact that if you are rich, you do not have to worry about, having all that preventative care while your mom was pregnant, so that it prevented genetic issues as well as, issues that come from low socioeconomic status. Those students that have that low SES, or they're below the poverty line, tend to have lower IQs because they end up with medical or genetic problems because they're not able to have that preventative care, and they're not able to get the enrichment that they need in order for their IQ to be higher. So just be aware that poverty does play a role in intelligence. All right, that is it. The class kick is already in the course, so you can go in there and work on that. That's going to help you reinforce ideas that we did not necessarily talk about in class, but that you need. If you have questions, just let me know. Those all are extra credit, but it's really important that you complete them. All right, that is it for me, guys. I will see you guys in class. Y'all have a great night. Bye, everybody.